Hello friends, we are here today with Dr. Jenny Daggers from UK. Dr. Daggers is an associate professor in theology at Liverpool Hope University, United Kingdom, a British citizen. She is a lay Anglican. Her publications include the British Christian Women's Movement, a rehabilitation of Eve, sacred spaces in interdisciplinary perspectives within contemporary contexts, gendering Christian ethics, postcolonial theology of religions, particularism and pluralism in the world of Christianity, and reimagining with Christian doctrines, responding to global gender injustice. So, Dr. Daggers, we're very honored that you agreed to do this interview for us. And can we start just by asking you, can you tell us something about your trajectory, your intellectual trajectory, and what were the major things that got you from there to here, so to speak?
Right, oh, thank you. Well, my first degree was in political science, University of Birmingham, a long time ago, before the advent of the women's liberation movement, feminist theory. So the main kind of axis there was Marxism, Marxist theory, which is where I began thinking in terms of critical consciousness. But then I had a long time in the workplace, and I got married, had 2 small children. What brought me back to academia was actually the debate that was going on in the Church of England about ordination of women.
I see.
Because unlike the North American context, where accuser ordained women in 1974 illegally, and then decided to legalize that act. In the Church of England, the debate went on till eventually the Church decided to ordain women in 1992. So it was that debate that brought my thoughts back to issues of theology, and I felt drawn back to the academy to do some serious thinking about the issues involved. So I started on an MA in social and pastoral theology at University of Manchester. So I dropped my children off at school, get on my bike, drive in, and it was an option with feminist studies. So that's where I began reading feminist theology, and I always read it in the light of feminist theory. So there were some quite strong women's studies courses in the wider university.
Right.
So I got involved in that, and it was a real sort of renaissance of learning for me, a whole new critical approach with feminist ideas at the centre, really. And then I had the opportunity to go on and do a PhD at Manchester, researching the British Christian women's movement in the 70s and 80s, 1970 to 1990. Using archive materials that's been collected of various women's groups concerned with women in the position of women in the churches, with the ordination debate as sort of the glue holding everything together, really, across quite a wide spectrum, from Catholic women's groups to Unitarian Quaker women's groups at the other end. So that was something I researched in some detail. And I actually began that the year after my church had agreed to ordain women. So we're sort of going back. So that was a step on the way. Though actually, while I was reading my MA, I think if I had had the chance to choose what I'd have studied, it would have been feminist philosophy, Luce Irigaray, and sort of postmodern thinking, because this was the 1990s when that was all new and fresh.
Right.
Instead, I did this task I was given by the university, which was actually very productive. Although in a way, I kept thinking I was kind of reining myself in a bit to work on these materials. There was no academic feminist theology in the UK. A couple of people coming to do PhDs towards the end of the period I was studying, but most of the writings were from the grassroots. And there were themes there that actually, although part of me was wanting to kind of follow the philosophy, these exciting ideas, the themes arising from my PhD research were actually quite, but because of the debate about the ordination of women, there was a lot of re-envisaging the tradition. When the American feminist theology I was reading, and to some extent feminist theology from Africa and Asia as well, I was reading at the time, was much more veering away from the tradition into new areas. The English writings kept using traditional terminology because they were trying to persuade people within the churches about the case for women's ordination. So that traditional theme, that returning tradition, is something that's kind of caught up on me. I got caught up in it, in something that at first I thought was rather parochial, less interesting. It's actually left a mark on my work. So when I finished my PhD, I was fortunate. I got a post at Liverpool Hope University and eventually a full-time post in the Department of Theology, Philosophy, Religious Studies. I then began reading very widely in more systematic theology, which I was interested in. I was asked to teach theology. It was a subject I hadn't studied at undergraduate level. So I learnt a lot through teaching. It's very hard work. At the same time, I was reading a lot of cultural studies, bringing the two together with the feminist sort of lens. So that was the sort of the direction of our work until I began working on the text Postcolonial Theology of Religions. And that represented a different line of inquiry where I began to raise the question of my own whiteness and how I might write as a white theologian. So it was very much flipping the coin, really. I was used to working with feminist theory from the underside, but then the next phase of my work was looking at my privilege in terms of my whiteness. And that's something I feel I'm just beginning to do.
Oh, I see.
And so and I think the insight of feminist theology, it gives me some insight into the colonized perspective, because I'm used to looking at the underside in gender terms.
Yeah.
But I'm also very aware that privilege is privilege. So I need to learn, instead of learning from my own experience of oppression, of the reduction of life chances for the women in my generation had to fight against, to begin to become conscious of this enduring privilege of whiteness that usually you can go your whole life without thinking about. You're a white person, you have that. Nothing forces you to think about it in the way that events of life had led me to think about issues of gender. So I've found that it's an interesting area to work on and very challenging, and I feel I'm only taking my first steps.
That's fantastic. It's wonderful to see how you have expanded the field of theology from new questionings and one challenging the other as you keep on going and reading and doing your research. So what would you say then, if you could tell us a little bit, what would be postcolonialism for you, in especially from where you're working from, in the relation between UK and the colonies, and so what would postcolonial theology means?
I think, like a lot of white intellectuals, I began reading postcolonial theory. So I think the first book I read, which I read it 10 years late was Robert Young's book. I haven't quite got the title now, but on postcolonialism, written from a literary criticism context, which I found very exciting, and also a bit perturbing. That, you know, I had worked very hard since coming back to do an MA PhD to deepen my knowledge, and I think in the light of post-colonial Western post-colonial theory, I could then begin to see that my whole knowledge was actually about the last 250 years of Western history, you know, European modernity and all the issues, and then post-modernity coming out of that, and then actually to begin to see how, although that's so exciting to me, it's also so parochial. So that was a bit of a shock, having worked so hard to amass this knowledge, to then realize it's just a little bubble here, actually. And then in a way, I've bypassed reading the big post-colonial theorists. I have read Said a bit, but Spivak and Homi Bhabha, I haven't really immersed myself in their writings to the extent that perhaps I've read Irigaray and Kristeva and thought about those style of thinking. So I think for me, in writing the book Postcolonial Theology of Religions, I made a decision that I wasn't going to use the lens of this quite high postcolonial theory, but rather what I wanted to do was to interrogate postcolonial from the perspective of the heritage of British Empire, and really wanting to analyse Christian attitudes to other religions in the context of the European project. That was really what I set out to do as the critical exercise in the first part of the book. And in a way, it's perhaps surprising that hadn't been done before, but because there are many people who might have written a similar kind of book. I don't think anybody's actually brought together that critique, almost the sort of historiographical account of what was going on in European modernity and within Christianity. So I think, to go back to your question, post-colonial, for me, I take it quite literally as a white British person, as being post-British Empire, and working with the legacy of that empire in our ongoing national life, in particular within our theology, and then more particularly within our theology of religions. So, is that where you, is that enough there?
Yeah. So how would you then say how the new tactics of the new empires, of the same old empires that still continue to be as an empire, what would see as the tactics in theology to keep sustaining the same discourse and the same structures that challenge us when we think about God in post-colonial ways? Is that clear?
So do you mean the tactics to think post-colonially, or the tactics for perpetuating colonialism?
For perpetuating, yes, colonialism, and the challenges for us.
Right, okay.
To think theologically.
The main tactic is not to acknowledge the problem, not to see the problem, not to see, to think too easily that we are post-colonial. Yes. Because we are post-empire in that form, that in its original form, the British Empire has finished, even though we may have this commonwealth for those nations who wish to still belong to it. So I think that sense that we've moved on, when actually, rather than looking at the continuities, is the biggest tactic. Right. I think that's the first one, and the second, there's a sort of guardianship of theology, which I think is quite strong in UK. I don't have a sufficient global view to know what goes on in UK, what impact it has outside my context. But certainly my sense is that there is an authorized form of theology which is quite powerful, which is linked to ongoing class privilege within in UK society, and educational privilege that goes with it. So linked to theology as taught in our most prestigious institutions, but which also then attract in international students, but particularly from the United States, from conservative theological backgrounds, and which legitimize an approach to theology that never stops to acknowledge context and its effect. This is the theological tradition, which is philosophically based, which is based in, if it's Protestant, in a strong study of Barth, Karl Barth, as the marker that you are a serious theologian, and very resistant to the voices of contextual theologies which have been called contextual theologies, that form of theology too is contextual, and that the context needs examination. So I think the main tactic is to protect and perpetuate a very intellectually demanding theological tradition, which is quite elitist, without acknowledging that it's a white tradition.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. And so, can you describe a little bit what a postcolonial theology of religions is, based on your book?
As well as I've talked about the first part of my book, which is the sort of critical analysis of Christian attitudes to religions in modernity. I've seen postmodernity and postcolonialism as creating new opportunities for theology of religion. So the way I've approached what I've done constructively is to begin by engaging feminist voices, both white feminist and Asian feminist voices, about religious diversity. The first part of my book, there was hardly a woman's voice to be heard, a little bit right at the end, but very little impact from women's voices in the modernity period. So I wanted to start the constructive work. So I start with an analysis of attitudes to religious diversity within white feminism, and then move to Asian American and Asian women's voices, and then also Asian men's theologies. So I kind of get to the men after the women. I've already sort of intimated in the first part of the book that Asian theology is usually in a male voice in the 20th century, had for a long time been proposing different attitudes towards religious diversity to those that are coming out of the missionary movement. So I engage very strongly with those voices. I've also, although I'm a feminist theologian, I do actually resist the view of doctrine that sees it as merely an effect of the will to power. I actually have if you like, a higher view of doctrine than that, or I see doctrine as something accessible to feminist reconstruction, that feminist reconstructions do not have to depart from doctrine and do different things. It's perfectly valid to do that. So I'm quite interested in staying with doctrine. So I developed a model after sort of listening to these feminist and Asian voices, developed a model of coming back to tradition, which actually had three strands to it. One is George Lindbeck's model, which I read very much through the lens. There was a second edition published on, I think it was the 25th or 20th anniversary of his publication of the book, where he very usefully writes a preface, which I don't think has had very much due attention. Because what I find is there's a lot of critique of Lindbeck as creating a model of theology of religions which could be called particularist, which comes back to emphasizing the distinctiveness of different religious traditions, which has been heavily criticized, though I approach what he did through the lens of this preface to the second edition, which I think actually provided quite a bit of ammunition to say he's perhaps been rather unfairly misread in some respects. Though I do use Catherine Tanner's reading of Lindbeck, which kind of moves it from his approach from a more modernist approach to something more fluid and postmodern. That's the second element. Cathy Tanner's, she has some very interesting things to say about the way in which cultural materials are borrowed and used within traditions. So I began to work with that, with a model of a doctrinal centre, but an open boundary with culture and with other traditions. Whereas Lindbeck is criticised for having a completely controlled, closed fortress boundary to tradition. So this notion of Cathy Tanner's of borrowing cultural materials and putting them to Christian use is one that I develop. And the third sort of input for my model is Janine Hill Fletcher's work, being the only feminist theologian who has written about religious diversity. And she's written about hybridity and fluidity. So with those components, I end up with attention to very open boundaries around traditions, a very dynamic view of tradition that is constantly borrowing materials from outside, and also in terms of interreligious relations, accepting that Christian materials will be borrowed and put to other use outside, just accepting that this is how it is. So I'm not interested in the policing of these boundaries, but it's that the boundary that things are dynamic. For myself, I'm interested in the possibility of bringing new materials within tradition and their transformation so that Christian doctrine is actually renewed and pertinent to contemporary cultures. That's my interest.
Right.
I recognise that other people's interests are more on what happens on the boundary or outside the boundary. Who am I to say that's a problem? It's just my own interests are kind of what happens when things are brought within and doctrine is re-enlivened by pertinent cultural materials that are to hand now, that therefore mean doctrine can be used differently.
I see.
So,
I see.
So then I kind of finish by taking that approach into Trinitarian thinking and review the different approaches and come up with a very traditional approach of using a very sparse Trinitarian rule to keep us working with doctrine, but to slough off the many cultural accretions, like, for example, the common assumption that to be doctrinally sound, that doctrine is somehow linked with all things heteropatriarchal and colonial, and that's how it is legitimately. To me, those things are illegitimate accretions.
I see.
To me, they don't belong with doctrine. So a sparse rule, that's not my own creation, it's already there in some of the debates. A sparse rule allows me to say, but in doing this, I'm not signing up for heteropatriarchy, and it's severing the assumed link, which is often never argued, but often assumed by those who do see themselves as guardians of orthodoxy.
I see. Right. In what ways are your work related or not to radical orthodoxy?
Oh, right. Well, I've enjoyed reading radical orthodoxy. And actually, I have real pleasure in reading these texts. I mean, I love Catherine Pickstock's After Writing, for example.
It's a great book.
And one thing I've done actually was one article that I've written, or it's a book chapter I've written, I put radical orthodoxy in conversation with Myra Rivera's touching transcendence within an argument. I was asked to contribute to a collection with the title "The Poverty of Radical Orthodoxy," but I kind of go across the grain a bit by arguing that there are some things in radical orthodoxy that I think feminist theology can work with, but its poverty is in its utter refusal to engage with liberation theologies, with material poverty, and to see that as integral. So in that chapter I've used the sort of picture of the cross, so that you've got the vertical direction of radical orthodoxy and the horizontal direction, say in Myra Rivera's beautiful constructive work, and that at the heart of the cross, these two can be held together, which is what interests me. So, for example, in that chapter, I argued that I thought Pickstock is always read, that she's read within the shadow of Millbank, and I sort of try and bring her out of that shadow and engage with her in her own terms, and find her work can be read in a more embodied way than it usually is.
That's fantastic. And so for us to close our time here, Dr. Daggers, what would you say are the challenges for theology today, considering what's going on in the world today? What would you think would be the challenges for us to think theology?
Right. I think one of the challenges is perhaps what should be taught as theology in different institutions. And I'm very excited. I've been excited by feminist theology. It's been my gateway into theology. I've been excited to learn more of systematic theology and how it works, the theology that's done in the most traditioned places. I've been very excited to start thinking in a post-colonial dimension and to challenge my own colonizer heritage and its implications. I'm so aware of theology happening in so many different centers and groups. I mean, if you take the American Academy of Religion as one marker of that, such a proliferation of theologies, all very rich in their own ways. To me, the question is, how can those be engaged with one another? I don't myself see, I've never seen feminist theology as a successor theology. I don't think the world would be a better place if we stopped teaching systematic theology and taught feminist theology instead. Although I think the world would be a better place if systematic theologians all engaged with feminist theology and postcolonial theology. It's a hard question to answer, but I do have a sense that so-called contextual theologies are not only for the people of of each context. I think that model of theology would be very fragmenting. So I think as theologies arise in different contexts, my own sense is we need to engage other theologies than our own. We need to learn how to read and listen, and particularly across boundaries of power, to read the theologies of those with whom we are situated in a power relation. Those are, if I'm more powerful in some respects, I need to read what it's like. So as somebody of colonizer heritage, I need to read the theologies of people of colonized heritage. I can't work it out for myself. But and I am convinced that the theologies of colonized heritage are not only for those who are colonized. If we're going to have peace in the world, we have to learn to engage different perspectives. I don't know how this is possible to teach. I do. You know, what should be on a 3-year undergraduate curriculum?
Right.
Who decides these things? And as I think we've been reminded in the conference here, what kind of pedagogy for teaching? The big questions.
Oh, this is fantastic, Dr. Daggers. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your trajectory, and thank you very much for your wonderful work.
Well, thank you, Claudio, for interviewing me in this way. Thank you.
Thank you.